The off-season tourist. One day, a distinguished gentleman in thick black-rimmed glasses appeared at the clinic. An off-season tourist, I thought. He asked to see me about a respiratory problem he was having. I told him that I was busy with some administrative work and that he should register with the emergency room. But he insisted. I was mildly irritated, but agreed to examine him and prescribed him some medicine. Then the man started asking questions and I grew suspicious. At that point, he must have realized he was pushing his luck. "I am Gianfranco Rossi," he said. "I'm a director." I was mortified. Of course, I knew who Rossi was. I had seen his 2013 documentary Sacro Gra, which won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival. He explained that he was on the island looking for inspiration for a possible film, but that he had found nothing, perhaps in part because the refugee reception center happened to be closed for renovations. Rossi would be leaving Lampedusa the following day. I knew I could not simply let him go. For years I had been searching for someone who would tell the world what was happening here. The shipwrecks had been covered by television stations from all over the world, but we needed something more permanent, something that would make a real impact. After an interview has been broadcast, it vanishes into the ether. It makes no lasting impression on viewers' minds and hearts. In other words, it is quickly forgotten. Today, everything is consumed with incredible speed. One tragedy soon gives way to another, for better or for worse. A new story only lives a few days. Perhaps with cinema, I thought, we'll be able to make something unforgettable. Rossi said, however, that he could not make a film about Lampedusa if he could not even imagine how it might begin. I begged him to reconsider and handed him the USB drive I used to document my patient stories. I had never given it to anyone else before, though I keep it with me at all times. There are 25 years of my life on this flash drive, I said, a chronicle of suffering. I made him promise that he would return it to me as I could not bear to lose it. He took it, thanked me, and left. When 2 days had passed, I was convinced that I would see neither Rosie nor my USB stick ever again. But on the third day, to my surprise, he reappeared. He had not left the island. "I looked at what you have on the drive," he said. "I'll make the film." I was delighted. "But I'll keep this stick, if you don't mind. I assure you, I shall take good care of it and give it back to you later." That was the beginning of an adventure. No one on the island knew that Rossi was making a film. He had no gear, no camera trucks, no clapperboard. He went around with a tiny video camera that almost looked amateurish. Even I thought he was just testing his ideas out, not shooting actual scenes. Every now and again he came by the clinic to say hello, and we became friends. Once he asked to shoot some footage of an ultrasound which I was giving to a young woman who had disembarked only a few hours beforehand. Next, he filmed an appointment I had with young Samuel, one of the most spirited local boys on Lampedusa. "Gianfranco, when are you finally going to start making this film?" was the question on everybody's lips. He never said a word in response. Then one day, Rossi told me he had finished the film. I could not believe he had managed to do it with so little fuss without disrupting life on the island at all. He returned the flash drive to me, and I plugged it in to check that it was working and had not been modified. As soon as I opened it, a photograph of a trawler full of migrants appeared on the screen. "Tell me about this," Rossi said. So I began to talk, explaining that those who could afford it bought first-class tickets that permitted them to travel above deck, while the airless cramped hold was reserved for the third-class travelers who could not. Little did I know this was in fact our final take in Fire at Sea. The film was named after the exclamation of Fuoco Kawamare, fire at sea, that spread through Lampedusa in 1943 when the Italian ship, the Maddalena, was bombarded and caught fire in the port. The cry had also become a popular song. A few months later, I received a telephone call from the producers of the film. Dr. Bartalo, you have to come to Rome. We are going to Berlin. Rossi's film was one of 20 in competition for the Golden and Silver Bears. I had not yet seen the film and did not even know what was in it. I was told to bring Rita with me because it was an important occasion. I remember us getting out of the limousine in Berlin and finding ourselves on the red carpet walking among the stars. What on earth were we doing there? At last I saw Fire at Sea. It hit me like a punch to the gut. I was glued to my seat when we left the cinema. I could not stop thinking about what I had seen. It was not just a documentary, it was a complicated narrative told at a measured pace and in hushed tones, but with captivating power and subtlety. The scenes impressed themselves upon my mind, sequence after sequence. At first glance, these images might have seemed similar to the many that we may have seen in recent years, but the way Rossi had shot them, unmediated with no filters, made them uniquely poignant. He had pulled it off. I felt victorious too because I had wanted this so badly, a raw, unequivocally clear message that would shatter all the lies and prejudice surrounding this issue, awaken the public conscience, and open people's eyes. That night in the hotel, Rita had to shake me awake more than once. I was sobbing in my sleep and breaking out in cold sweats. I was reliving one of my worst nightmares. It was July 31st, 2011. As always, I was on Favororo Pier. A great many refugees had come in that afternoon around 9 in the evening. A fishing boat of roughly 36 feet in length docked at the pier with 250 people on board. With the younger doctor, I began to examine the passengers, allowing them to disembark one by one. They were all distraught. Some were wailing and tearing at their hair. Others were weeping silent tears. We could not understand why. No one was severely ill, and there had not been any deaths on board. The last migrants to disembark told me there was a problem in the hold, but said no more. It was almost nightfall, and the boat was empty. I found the hatch to the hold, which was in fact a freezer for storing fish, and lifted it. The opening was narrow, and below was pitch black. I could only just squeeze through and lower myself inside. It was stuffy, and there was an unpleasantly sweet smell in the air. Blindly I felt for the floor and found that it was soft and uneven beneath my feet. I took a few tentative steps forward. It was a peculiar sensation, as if I were walking on cushions. Meanwhile, the strange odor had thickened and now was unbearably strong. I fumbled for my mobile telephone and switched on the torch. The floor lit up and I found myself in a chamber of hell. The hold was paved entirely with corpses. I had been walking on dead bodies, innumerable young bodies. They were naked, piled on top of each other, some with limbs intertwined. It was Dantesque. The walls were scratched and dripping with blood. Many of these young dead people had no fingernails. I scrambled up and out of the hold and vomited on the deck. I was shaken, lost, overwhelmed. I could scarcely believe it was real. I went to tell the others on the pier what I had seen. They too were in disbelief. Then a firefighter climbed down there and began to bring up the bodies. He tied loops of rope around them and we hauled them out one by one. We laid the victims down on the pier. Many had fractured skulls and hands. They had clearly been beaten. The survivors were the brothers, sisters, and friends of those massacred in the hold. That was why they had been so distressed. The traffickers had threatened and intimidated them into remaining silent, but as soon as the police began to question them, the awful truth came out. The first 50 migrants to board the boat in Libya had been stuffed into that freezer. They were the youngest and thinnest and had been selected to go first because they could most easily fit through the hatch. Another 250 were above deck. The boat was overloaded. The only air in the hold entered through a tiny porthole, but the passengers underneath were told that as soon as the boat left the harbor, they would be allowed on deck. 25 of them were released, but then with the vessel grew unstable and the traffickers stopped the others from following. Unable to breathe, they yelled and tried to climb out, but the smugglers beat them and threw them back into the freezer. Desperate to escape, they tried to push their way out altogether so that even the blows could not stop them. But human violence knows no limits. The smugglers took the cabin door off its hinge, planted it on the porthole, and sat on it. There was no more air, no more life. 15 minutes was all it took to snuff out 25 lives. 15 minutes in which those poor young people did everything they could think of to survive. 15 minutes that must have seemed a century to them. When I examined their bodies, I could see why the walls had been covered in blood. They had been trying to tear the boards off them, scraping them until their fingers bled and their nails ripped, until their hands were reduced to raw flesh and splinters. For days afterward, I could think of nothing else. I could not forgive myself for having stepped on and desecrated the victims. Images of scratched walls, shattered bones, and blood-soaked rooms came back to ambush my mind again and again, like a scene from a horror film. I heard those young people screaming in despair. They had stripped off their clothes in their struggle to survive in that airless, lightless hole. I saw their fractured hands clawing at the wood, 50 bloody hands, 25 screaming voices, and the others above deck forced to remain impassive, though they know exactly what was happening. They had to pretend they could not hear the imploring voices of their companions as they died like rats in a trap. When I thought about the brutes that did this, I saw red. On that night of nightmares in Berlin, my rage had floated back to the surface. The next day I awoke feeling wretched, still drenched in sweat. In the morning, Rita and I returned to Rome. She went straight on to Lampedusa, but I stayed in the capital in case we were summoned back to Berlin. And indeed we were. On the evening of the verdict, February 20th, 2016, Rossi and I sat side by side. Each time a prize was given, we trembled. 6th place, 5th, 4th, 3rd. Every name called out on the stage made us jump. When they read the name of the film in 2nd place, we leaped for joy. We had won. We had been awarded the Golden Bear. We could hardly believe it. Fire at Sea had swayed the jury. I shall never forget Meryl Streep's words. Fire at Sea is urgent, imaginative, and necessary filmmaking. The work of 25 years flashed before my eyes. I almost had another stroke, but my excitement soon subsided. It is true that we had succeeded in spreading our message, but it is also true that those who should have done something concrete in response have failed to do so. Instead, borders have been callously reinforced, barriers and insurmountable walls erected, closed borders, minds, and hearts. No one paid attention to Pope Francis's words on Lesbos, calling this the worst humanitarian disaster since the Second World War, or his gesture of welcoming 3 refugee families into the Vatican. I was received by the Pope in a private audience immediately after his visit to Lesbos. In his eyes, I could read sadness like mine. He was conscious that we are surrounded by invisible walls without doors, that we are fighting a helpless battle against those who want to rid themselves of the problem by simply ignoring it. In 2017, Fire at Sea was also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature. That day I was shaking with emotion, though I had told myself to stay calm. Not long before that, when the Pope visited Lampedusa, shortly before the shipwreck of October 3rd, 2013, my feelings had got the better of me and I had been unable to speak to him. When I came face to face with him in private, I wept. Holy Father, help us, I said. Keep us from having to see more dead bodies in Lampedusa. Let us go to Libya and bring the migrants here ourselves. Let us stop allowing all this to happen. The Pope gave me a rosary, a chaplet that I have kept with me ever since. Then he spoke of all the pain he had witnessed on Lesbos, which is Lampedusa's sister in suffering. Fire at Sea arrived on the island 2 months later on April 16th. The screening was a grand affair, especially since we do not have a cinema on the island. Rosie and I were very nervous. We were afraid Lampedusans would find fault with the film or be upset by it. But our fears were unfounded. Although the audience had a few quibbles, The film was a success on Lampudessa too, and on that extraordinary day, something even better happened. The RAI, Italy's public service broadcaster, had wanted to make a donation to Lampudessa's health service in honor of fire at sea. They had contacted me to ask what would be most helpful, specifying that the donation did not necessarily have to be linked to the refugees. So I asked for some musical instruments for the Center for Disabled Children, since I had noticed that they enjoyed plonking away on their plastic toy pianos. When the children took a real keyboard, a guitar, and a bright red accordion out of the boxes, they began to play as though they had never done anything else. They were ecstatic. Half the island joined us in the center's main hall to celebrate. We were all moved to see the joy in the eyes of Rosalba, Celestina, Franco, and Salvatore. Only Claudio, a boy I am especially fond of, was not there. When the party was almost over and I had given up hope of seeing him, he finally arrived. He hugged me, and then trembling, he picked up the accordion. For a moment he struggled to find the keys, but then the music streamed forth, as if by magic. It was a marvelous sight, everyone playing, singing, and dancing together. At last I was home. In all those months of great tension and emotion, that day was the best by far. That place was my very own, red carpet, the place where I could truly live life to the full. Never shall I forget. If the walls of Lampudessa's clinic could speak, they would point to a book we have read but forgotten all too soon. In his memoir, Night, Elie Wiesel narrates his experience of being deported to the concentration camps at Auschwitz, Buna, and Buchenwald, where he lost his identity, became nothing more than a number. Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, which has turned my life into one long night, sometimes cursed and sometimes sealed, he writes. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the little faces of the children, whose bodies I soon turned into wreaths of smoke beneath a silent blue sky. I quote these words because they are not too far from our reality. When one group of refugees arrived, I examined some 70 emaciated children. They were dehydrated and starving. They had traveled third class on the boat for 7 days, crammed into the hold with all the others, who could not afford to pay for passage above board. Their bodies were scarred with knife wounds, cigarette burns, and other torments inflicted on them by their jailers. Libyan prisons are the new concentration camps. The conditions under which migrants travel across desert and sea are not dissimilar from those of the death trains that transported victims of the Holocaust. People who want to put up walls and turn refugees away today are not acting all that differently from the Nazi collaborators who, in the words of philosopher Hannah Arendt, embody the banality of evil. Anyone willing to countenance thousands of children dying at sea or living in subhuman conditions within the confines of refugee camps is just as cruel as they were. Two people played especially significant roles in reinforcing this belief of mine. The first I met in the clinic of Lampudessa, which is fast becoming not only a locus of recovery, but also one of discussion and chance encounter. In mid-2014, the Polish reporter and poet Jaroslaw Mikolajewski came to my office to interview me about the crisis. Almost in spite of myself, I poured out my heart to him. I explained what was happening and told him how indignant I was at the scale of the tragedies we were seeing. I told him everything. I wanted him to take a little of my outrage home with him to his country. But that was not only my reason for confiding in him. I also found an inexplicable affinity with this man whom I had known for only half an hour. I could sense his empathy. Despite our different origins and experiences, we both have the bare, unarmed instinct of brotherhood, he later wrote to me. We know that the human race is our family, and that all of our fellow men are a part of us. When in October 2015 I was invited to Krakow to receive the Sergio Vieta Mello Award for Humanitarian Action, Jaroslaw took me on a bar crawl. We made a stop at Alchemia, a well-known club in the historic Jewish quarter of Kazimierz, and drank vodka. It was a surreal experience. I could not remember the last time I had been somewhere where there would be no continual telephone calls and requests to come to the pier. Time had stopped, and he was the person who made it stop. The second encounter, which was also thanks to Jaroslaw, took place during that visit to Krakow. At the Hotel Osteria, the beating heart of the local Jewish community, we sat at a table with Leopold Kozlowski, known as the Last Klezmer. Kozlowski is a musician, composer, and singer who appeared in the Steven Spielberg film Schindler's List. Jaroslaw introduced me to Kozlowski and told him a little about my job. The musician looked into my eyes, and just as I had done with Jaroslaw, immediately began to speak. He told me things that, according to Jaroslaw, he only ever said to people in whom he saw his own humanity reflected. He told me how during the Nazi occupation he had watched the Jewish population of Krakow die, how he had lost everything, and when I say everything, I mean everything, he said firmly. He spoke about the 2 years he had spent in concentration camps, accompanying the victims to their deaths with his music. The Nazis had forced him to play for their pleasure time and again, and his art had saved him from being exterminated. The testimony of this small, strong 96-year-old man left us aghast. Pietro looked at the old klezmer. Jaroslaw wrote in a private account of that meeting, no, he was not old, but ancient as his people who were chosen for eternal suffering. The doctor's face was like that of John Paul II on the eve of his death, when he wanted to greet the world from Piazza San Pietro but could not. Leopold rose and seized his hand. It was clear from that handshake that the two would understand each other in that moment and forever. Sometimes, unfortunately, cruelty comes from unexpected quarters. One day, 250 migrants arrived at the pier. They were all in good condition, and as usual, the Guardia di Finanza was helping to transport them to the reception center. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw two well-built soldiers bundling a couple of the migrants into a jeep. They were thin, sub-Saharan boys exhausted from the journey. Instead of heading into town, the jeep drove off in the direction of the airport. I pointed this out to the other doctor who was with me, and we jumped on my Vespa to follow them. We pursued the jeep into the open fields where the soldiers pulled over. They dragged their passengers out of the vehicle and, for no reason whatsoever, began to rain kicks and punches on them. Just like that, in an act of gratuitous violence. I accelerated hard until we caught up with them. "What are you doing, you gutless bastards?" my colleague said. "Stop that right now." They could only have been on Lampedusa for a few days because they did not recognize us. "Who are you and what do you want? Show us some ID." "Who are you and what do you think you are doing?" Tension mounted. It was like a scene from a Western. The soldiers had not expected company and had certainly not anticipated our reaction. "Come with us to the barracks." "On the contrary," I said, "you are coming with me because I'm going to make sure you will not get away with this." It was agreed that I would go with the soldiers and the boys in the jeep, and that my colleague would take my Vespa into the reception center and notify the staff that we were on our way. Meanwhile, the two migrants were on the ground. Though they were clearly in pain and terribly afraid, they said nothing. I went to them to check for serious injuries. Luckily, they had no broken bones. Carefully, I helped them into the jeep one by one and sat beside them, doing my best to communicate that no further harm would come to them. The soldiers got into the front seats, and we set off in silence. When we reached the reception center, I helped the boys inside and asked a trusted interpreter to take special care of them. Then we went on to the barracks. The commandant was surprised to see me getting out of the jeep with his men. He came and gave me a hug. "What brings you here?" The two soldiers hung back. Now they had seen the commandant greet me. They knew they were in trouble. I told him the story, my voice shaking as I struggled to contain my rage. "Commandant, either these two leave Lampedusa before the day is out, or I shall make this a matter of national and international news. These clowns will be the laughing stock of Italy." Here I am, almost killing myself to save as many people as possible, and they have beaten those boys black and blue. What were they thinking? I was on the warpath. Those soldiers had no excuse for acting like fascist black shirts, and there was nothing to be said in their defense. The commandant glowered at his men, visibly embarrassed. The next morning, the soldiers had already been transferred elsewhere. They never set foot on Lampedusa again. Who knows what would have happened if we had not caught up with them in time? What is more, their disgraceful conduct once again risked damaging the credibility of their colleagues, hundreds of whom fulfill their critical role in helping refugees with due professionalism and humanity.